What are the jhanas in Buddhism? This is a big question, and initially I had intended to do a single video on all 4 of the jhanas, because there are 4 of them. However, in producing the video and trying to write up the video and ideas, I realized that it would probably take much more than a time that I wanted, so I've decided to split it up into 4 separate videos, one on each of the jhanas. So in today's video, what I'm going to be dealing with is the first jhana. However, before getting to that, I do want to talk about jhanas in general. Jhanas in general are pleasant states of deep meditation. And they take an enormous amount, not really enormous, but a large amount of time and effort to achieve. In other words, they're not the sorts of things that you can achieve with, by doing only a few minutes of meditation a day. It takes a lot of meditation, a lot of time sitting regularly to be able to achieve them. As a result, they have been downplayed in a lot of later Buddhist schools, and indeed downplayed in much contemporary Buddhism as well. Some people may be familiar with Insight Buddhism. In Insight Buddhism, which is a version of Theravada Buddhism, jhanas were basically left aside. However, things have begun to change in the last decade or so, and jhanas have become more popular again. So now you will find people teaching them to lay audiences as well as to monastics. Well, what about the historical background of jhana? There's a lot that we don't really know, so I'm going to begin the story with Gautama, the Buddha-to-be, his decision to leave home, leave the palace, go out into the wilderness and search for enlightenment. And one of the parts of this search for enlightenment was that he undertook a number of very severe austerities, painful sorts of practices that seem to have been designed out of a feeling that there was something wrong with sense pleasure. In other words, sense pleasure was bad, and the way to rid ourselves of our desire for sense pleasure was to undergo a lot of severe austerities. He went through, it's said historically, that he went through many, many years of this, or several years anyhow, and began to realize that it was kind of a dead end. But the breakthrough, at least as told in the early texts that Gautama had at this point, was when he recalled back to his youth, when he was sitting under a rose apple tree and attained a very pleasurable state of meditation, which was the first jhana. So he remembered it both as a blameless source of pleasure, and in that remembering began to realize that there was nothing wrong with pleasure itself. The problem lay somewhere else. And so, in other words, the Buddha could continue on his journey without having to have a terrible reaction against pleasurable states. In particular, that the state of jhana was pleasurable, but was also, the Buddha says, blameless, that there was no real problem with it. In fact, the Buddha says that jhana is more pleasurable than any sense pleasure that we can gain. So, part of the use of jhana in early Buddhist practice is to help wean us away from our desire for ordinary sense pleasures. In other words, when we begin to learn that there are pleasures of meditation that are greater than any that we can achieve through our senses, then perhaps we can begin to relax around our ordinary desire to always gain sense pleasures. And then later on, we'll have to deal with our desire perhaps for jhana, which is somewhat subtler, but that's at least a somewhat more advanced problem to have, and outside of the scope of this video at any rate. Now, the subject of exactly how to understand jhana is controversial. There are many different disagreements about what jhana really is. Generally speaking, it's understood that jhana is a form of what we might call meditative absorption. That is, it's a meditative, these are a series of meditative states, 4 of them, that are progressively more and more absorbed into their mental object. So we leave the world behind to a large extent. shut the world out simply because the mind is so focused on or absorbed in or unified in its experience in these particular states that we'll get to. Now, the precise level of that absorption and what that really entails, that's part of the controversy nowadays. I did a video a while back on this very subject, on how deep this absorption has to be and all the different, or several anyway, different opinions about it. I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes in case you want to know more, because that's sort of outside the scope of what I'll be discussing today. So with that as the background then, what is the first jhana? To get an answer to that question, one of the places we can look is in a definition of the 8th step in the Eightfold Path, which is generally translated right concentration. Many of us will know the Eightfold Path, perhaps the most famous path of practice described in early Buddhism. The 8th of those stages, again, is right concentration. Right concentration, at least in certain suttas, is defined in terms of the achievement of these 4 jhanas. And so in these videos that I'll be doing on the jhanas, I'll be relying on this one particular sutta that defines right concentration in terms of these jhanas and then defines each of the jhanas in turn. So what does it have to say about the first jhana? Well, what it says is, it's when a mendicant or a monastic, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unskillful qualities, enters and remains in the first absorption, or first jhana, which has the rapture and bliss born of seclusion, while placing the mind and keeping it connected. Now, this is a complex definition here with a lot of technical terminology. I'll try to unpack some of it here. Again, a lot of these terms are controversial. There are different ways of interpreting them. But to begin with, it talks about being secluded from sensual pleasures and secluded from unskillful states. Now, being secluded from sense pleasures, well, part of that means that we're no longer, looking around. We don't have our eyes open. We're no longer sort of actively listening at things in the world, trying to hear nice music and so on. But it also means, in a deeper way, that we're secluded from what are called the hindrances, the 5 hindrances to meditation. Now, I'm not going to go into a deep analysis of the 5 hindrances here. I've done prior videos on those, and I'll leave a link to one of them down below in the notes if you're not familiar with the hindrances. But basically, the 5 hindrances are the hindrance of sense pleasures, of looking for sense pleasures, basically, of ill will, which is a form of anger or hatred, of being sleepy. Sleepiness is a hindrance. Restlessness and remorse is a hindrance. That's considered a single state there, restlessness and remorse. But basically that's the sort of mind that's flitting from this thing to that. And finally, the 5th hindrance is doubt. Now, ordinarily, I think most of us will be familiar that in meditation, normal breathing meditation will be beset by one or another of these hindrances in turn. So perhaps we'll be thinking about a beautiful beach or a beautiful person or something like that. That's sense pleasure. That's the hindrance of sense pleasure, taking us away from the object of our meditation. Or we maybe get angry at somebody, think about, turn over some annoyance in our mind, ill will. We may be sleepy, that often happens. Or we may just have a monkey mind that sort of flits around from one thing and another and can't settle down. Or, again, we may have doubts. So these are things that keep us from being able to achieve jhana, the first jhana in particular. What we have to do is seclude ourselves from these pleasures, overcome, I'm sorry, not the pleasures, but these hindrances, overcome the hindrances so that the mind becomes placid. Once the mind is placid and stable to an extent, then at least there's the opportunity for this first jhana to arise. The definition also says that we're secluded. This is, indeed, jhana is, meditation is a form of renunciation, of seclusion from the world, at least for a time. It's said that there are various what are called thorns to each of these jhanic states. That is, things that, when they occur, tend to make the jhanic state not arise. And so it's said that sound is a thorn to the first jhana. which basically means that if we're in an environment with a lot of sound, a lot of noise, we're not going to be able to achieve the first jhana because the sounds will always be directing our mind this way and that and keeping us from becoming focused enough, quiet enough in the mind to be able to have this jhana arise. But if we are able to do this, then it's said that a certain very happy state arises, what's termed, at least in this translation, to be rapture and bliss. Now these are two Pali terms, piti and sukha. Piti is basically a form of very active, kind of bubbling, pleasurable state that we feel in the mind, perhaps when something very nice happens. It's a very sort of active mental state. We'll get into that in a moment. The other side of this is the bliss or happiness. The Pali word is sukha. Sukha is the opposite of dukkha. So dukkha is, many of us will be familiar with the First Noble Truth, dukkha, pain, suffering, unpleasantness. Well, its opposite is sukha, is happiness, bliss. So when this first jhana arises, out of this sort of calm mind, it sort of arises spontaneously. What arises is this mix of bubbling state of pleasure with a sort of a general, more placid, happy state as well, or blissful state. Now the last part of the definition is a little complicated and open to interpretation. It talks about while placing the mind and keeping it connected. The Pali terms here are vitakka and vichara, savitakang, savicharang, that is with keeping the mind, placing the mind and keeping it connected. These are mental operations. Vitakka means to place the mind on an object. So for example, we might think of doing breath meditation. There's a mental operation which is when our mind is thinking about something else, there's a mental operation of realizing what it's doing and then bringing the mind back to the breath. That's vitakka. That's understood as vitakka. And vichara is the operation of keeping the mind connected. Or keeping the mind on its object. So once the mind has been, let's say, placed on the breath, if we're talking about breathing meditation, then there's a mental operation of sort of stabilizing it, holding it there, so that it doesn't move off. Now obviously these vitakka and vichara are hardly perfect. We don't have perfect control over them. The mind tends to wander anyway. But the point is that in this first jhana, both of these states are active. There is an active state of placing the mind on the meditative state of bliss and happiness and rapture. There is also the state of keeping it connected. Now, some scholars believe that these two words, vitakka and vichara, originally both meant sort of thinking. They were sort of basically synonyms, rough synonyms for thinking. They didn't have such highfalutin kinds of interpretations as placing the mind and keeping it connected. So some scholars would interpret vitakka and vichara as something more like thinking and pondering. Or for example, Bhikkhu Bodhi in his translation of this passage has thought and examination. Again, two kinds of thinking. But the basic idea, if we take this latter interpretation of vitakka and vichara, basically means that in the first jhana, perhaps we can have very quiet kinds of thoughts going on in the background, or realizations, understandings, kind of mental activity bubbling around in the background while we're experiencing this rapturous and blissful state. This is, however, one of these things that's hotly disputed among practitioners of jhana. So it's up in the air what we consider jhana and what we want to say about it. The Pali terms, again, have various interpretations. Now there's also a simile involved with each of these jhanic states that the Buddha talks about, and the similes, I think, are very, very important because they give us additional kinds of insight into what these jhanic states are like. So we read about the simile for the first jhana. It's like when a deft bathroom attendant or their apprentice pours bath powder into a bronze dish, sprinkling it little by little with water. They knead it until the ball of bath powder is soaked and saturated with moisture, spread through inside and out, yet no moisture oozes out. In the same way, a mendicant drenches, steeps, fills, and spreads their body with rapture and bliss, born of seclusion. There's no part of the body that's not spread with rapture and bliss, born of seclusion. Now, I think this is a wonderful kind of simile here, and there are a couple of different things that I can take out of it. There are, of course, many things we might say, but a couple of things that spring to mind. First of all, it talks about how the body of the practitioner, of the monastic, the monk, is suffused, steeped, filled with this rapture and bliss. This may be one of the reasons why this state, and indeed all of these four jhanic states that we'll be discussing, are the same way. They're states that at least in these similes are described as being felt in the body. They're body states. And this separates them from other kinds of deep meditative states known as the formless attainments that I'll get to in a subsequent video. These are the form jhanas. They're sometimes known as the form jhanas. Form meaning physical form. They're related to body in a certain way, at least in the experience, at least in these similes. Again, there are disagreements about how much of them is felt in the body, but in the similes it's quite clear that they are felt in the body. The second point here is that the simile we have is an active simile. There's a bath attendant that's kneading this bath powder actively in order to incorporate water into it. In the same way, we can think of the mental operations we were discussing earlier, vitaka and vichara, these active mental operations, either placing the mind and keeping it connected, or simply thoughts that are going on in the background, depending on how we interpret them. But in any event, this is a very active kind of willed state, at least to an extent. We can't literally will the first jhana into being. That's impossible. It just sort of arises. But at least the way it's described in these texts, it is a state that's involved, again, with active mental operation. And so that's how we should think of this kind of kneading operation by the bath attendant. Now, in the next video, I'll get to the second jhana, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen when it's ready to be viewed. If you're getting anything out of these videos of mine, take a look over at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.